what does the National Security Bill change in Hong Kong?
I think if you look at the basic law, which has been the cardinal law governing Hong Kong since July the 1st, 1997, there is a particular provision, Article 23, which stipulates that the Hong Kong SAR government, through its LegCo, should adopt a national security law in Hong Kong. For very obvious reasons, over the past several years, we know this effort has not been successful. Therefore, and for very obvious reasons, we do not need to go into all the ups and downs of all the political events in Hong Kong over the past several years, which have prevented the enactment of this law in Hong Kong. Therefore, I think people should not pretend to be surprised that China, being the ultimate sovereign power over Hong Kong, has the legitimate right to take action to amend the basic law in such a way that the national security law could be inserted into the basic law as the cardinal law for Hong Kong. The second point I want to add is that look around the world. No country anywhere else in the world would ever allow part of its sovereign territory to be misused to constitute a threat to its own national security. Look at the United States vis-a-vis Puerto Rico. Does anyone really believe that the United States government will ever allow anyone to misuse Puerto Rico to be a threat to the US national security interest? No. Whether it is one country, one system, one country, two system, one country, three system, if any, no such precedent has ever happened, and no such action will ever be allowed going forward. And the third point I want to emphasize is the national security law is only targeting a very, very limited number of behavior or people who actually want to constitute a threat to the national security interest of China, like overthrowing China, overthrowing the ruling party over here, or creating a separate entity for Hong Kong, in Hong Kong independence, for example. These things are taboos under the basic law anyway, and I don't think the majority of the people in Hong Kong would ever want to do any such behavior which will constitute a threat to China's national security interests.
And moving on to do with the timing, why does China want to introduce this bill in Hong Kong now?
Well, Hong Kong has been back to China's sovereignty exercise for 23 years by now. And China actually, for many years, has abided by the one country, two system, literally to the hilt of their understanding. And China did not interfere, for example, in the educational system in Hong Kong. And China didn't even bother to spend lots of time with the student unions or the trade unions in Hong Kong, and who have been very active in engaging with these society groups, for example. We know for sure there are lots of foreign infiltration into these entities. And I will say China's bottom line is very clear. According to the basic law, Hong Kong should be run by people in Hong Kong on the basis of the one country, two system. But for 1 year at least, we see all the turmoil and the attack on rule of law in Hong Kong. And arson is very, very commonplace, and attack on innocent people and blocking streets, for example, these illegal demonstrations and gathering of people have become the norm in Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong, being a very small, compact place, very good for doing business, cannot afford to lose rule of law, and instability on such scale will doom Hong Kong as a free port, as an economy, and loss of job will be very, very natural. The next step, flight of capital will happen. And I think the livelihood of people in Hong Kong will be doomed to failure if chaos breaks out. Now, I've been talking about this for more than 1 year. And if we compare the situation in Hong Kong with what's happening in the United States, this police brutality, etc., President Donald Trump threatening to use the military to quell the rioting, for example. Now I think America should keep its mouth shut because of the turmoil in the United States. The situations in Hong Kong and the United States are very different in nature, but I don't think any society can afford to lose rule of law, and I'm firmly opposed to any demonstrations and protests which are illegal. People in Hong Kong have the fully legally protected rights to demonstrate and protest on the condition they are lawful and legal demonstrations and protests.
I should share to move on and talk a little bit about China and how it's handled the coronavirus outbreak. With that now seemingly under control, how do you think it will affect China's growth prospects in the short term and long term?
Well, China was the first victim of the pandemic. And back in January, February, and much of March, China was the only country, to some extent, struggling in the water. And we know what China did. China did absolutely the best thing you can imagine to do the tracing, identification, lockdown, quarantine, and at the meantime, they spend a lot of time to develop vaccine and cure experiments and research, as we understand, are still going on, and hopefully they will be successful. And I think in dealing with this pandemic, it's not different from dealing with any other large-scale pandemic. You have, a very well-established process that every government needs to follow. Any short-changing of the efforts will not work. And the coronavirus, being the common threat and common enemy of mankind, actually wants to move around, try to find the weakest link to break through and conquer mankind. So, in a sense, what China has been doing is a national overarching strategy, mobilizing all the resources in China to cut off the spread of the coronavirus. China, by now, is the first country, or the first major country in the world, which has fought off the coronavirus, at least the domestically generated coronavirus. And the focus right now is to fight off imported foreign cases, which might be brought back to China by, let's say, foreign visitors, returned Chinese students, Chinese workers coming back home from foreign countries, etc. So we can see that in order to really win the fight against coronavirus, all the countries in the world need to be united to do a common job against the coronavirus. And therefore, I think cooperation under the WHO will be crucial. Any country which is weakening WHO should be the public enemy of the whole world. No country should be allowed to, weaken or even sabotage the international cooperation under the umbrella of the WHO and also under the umbrella of the United Nations. China's task right now is to jumpstart its economy. China was completely shut down in February. And I would say China probably lost a total of 2 months of working months. It's a lot of work. Chinese economic growth in the first quarter of this year contracted by 6.8%. This is unprecedented. We all know that the Chinese economy for the past 40 years or so has been steadily growing. Every year, economic growth on average would have grown by 9 to 10%. But the first quarter, contraction by 6.8%. That's a lot of contraction for China. And I would say for the rest of the year, the economy probably will improve gradually but significantly. So by the year end, hopefully, the Chinese economic growth for the whole year of 2020 probably will be at about This is very low compared with the Chinese growth rates over the past 40 years. But if you compare that with many other countries in the world, this will be, again, one of the highest and most robust economic growth rate for China in 2020. And also, Chinese economy is very much integrated with the rest of the world, and China has been the major contributor of the annual GDP growth of the world. China now is the largest trading partner with almost more than 100 countries in the world. So economic growth in China is absolutely important for China, but also for its largest and large important trading partners, but also very much so for the rest of the world.
I want to move on to a story that's been on the periphery of the news recently, and that's some skirmishes at the India-China border. Could you shed some light on the issues there, and whether it's a threat to stability in the region?
China and India are the two largest populations in the world. China having 1.4 billion, India's population is about 1.3 billion, and any armed conflict between these two largest populations in the world will be a disaster for China, but also a disaster for India. Therefore, I'm a firm advocate of peace and stability between these two very important, very large countries. Now, China and India has one of the longest land borders in the world, divided more or less into three sections: eastern section, western section, and the middle section. And there are lots of the sections of the border which are disputed between the two countries. And this is a reality. This needs to be handled very carefully to avoid any flaring up of tension or deterioration of the situation into confrontation, etc. I'm actually confident that both China and India will find a way to handle whatever border tension between them very carefully, because neither China nor India can afford to have a total confrontation along their very long land border, which are mostly in the very mountainous regions. The dividing lines along the Himalaya mountains in the world. So I hope the Chinese government and the Indian government will have all the rationality and the sanity that they need, and they can handle the tensions along the border very carefully. It's very encouraging to see that the higher military commanders of both the Chinese army and the Indian army are now talking with each other, and the leaders of the two countries are very eager to talk to each other to make sure that whatever tensions there are, they are not getting out of control. And also, please note one particular thing, that is, no gunshot has ever been fired between between China and India along its border, and this is, very much of a result of the Indian-China border war of 1962. Ever since 1962, the two countries more or less have a tacit commitment to each other not to fire a single shot at the other, and whatever problems they may have, even fist fights, bodily confrontations between the soldiers of the two countries, will eventually be handled very prudently, and they will not escalate out of control. And I truly believe this should not be an exception this time, and hopefully calm should be restored as quickly as possible. So don't lose sanity about China-Indian border disputes. They are well taken care of.
Thank you. And finally, to move on to a news story that's obviously been in the public eye for a couple of years now, how do you think the November elections in the USA will affect the ongoing US-China trade war?
I think President Donald Trump probably will do whatever he can to win the re-election. And I'm afraid the United States will be doomed if President Trump wins, and the United States will be doomed if President Trump loses the election. Why? Because if he wins the re-election in November, probably President Trump will lose any constraint or restraint if any is left, and he will do the purge, he will do the reconciliation, or he will do sabotage against whatever he believes to be his enemy, domestic or foreign. But if he loses the election, I don't think he will stop kicking and screaming, and he will not acknowledge defeat. He will insist on recounting and recounting of all the ballots, and he probably will refuse to recognize and acknowledge the decision by any court, including the Supreme Court of the United States. And I suspect President Donald Trump probably will be the first incumbent US president to call for insurrection among some of his supporters in order to really try to reverse the decisions or the result of the votes in November. So I worry about the presidential election in the United States for this year. And I think the situation in the United States will become more turmoil, and it will really tear the US reputation in the world into pieces before it can really settle down for the new government to become effectively leading in terms of domestic leadership in the United States, as well as in terms of US global leadership. And I would say China has becoming the big scapegoat as far as US politics is concerned. Most of the politicians in the United States, if not all, take a great pleasure in bashing China, as if bashing China will give them more votes among people. I would say China-US relations are being poisoned as we speak. And China and the United States, being the two most important countries in the world, need to find a way to get along with each other rather than to get to each other's throat. And the current situation in China-US relations are probably the worst ever since Dr. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China in 1971, and since the normalization of relations between China and the United States in 1979. But it could be much worse in the running up to the presidential election in November, and in the transitional period between early November to January the 20th, 2021, and in the new administration, whether by Trump or by Biden, I think it will probably get worse before it can ever get better. But in the medium and longer term, I'm actually confident about China-US relations. Why? For a couple of very brief points. One is that, as Dr. Henry Kissinger correctly pointed out, war should not be an option between China and the United States. Both are nuclear powers, both are armed to the teeth, and any armed conflict between China and the United States will not stay contained in the conventional sphere. It will easily get out of control and escalate out of the conventional sphere, and it will result in mutual assured destruction of each other. So neither China nor the United States will come out of an armed conflict between these two countries as a net winner. Both probably will be destroyed. So I would strongly urge any decision maker in China and in the United States to think twice and always put a premium on peace, and always oppose anyone who is doing the warmongering between China and the United States. Second point, equally important, short of a total war between China and the United States, neither China nor the United States can ever achieve holding the other country onto the ground without consequences. No way. China does not want to think about holding the United States down to the ground. There are lots of people in the United States who dream about holding China down to the ground, but it's not possible short of a total war. But in a total war, both will be destroyed. So what's the fun of complete alienation between the two countries? Therefore, I think it brings only to the very logical, realistic option. That is, China and the United States, whether they like each other or not, that's a separate issue, but they need to get along with each other. They need to treat each other as an equal. They need to make sure that they are not pursuing a zero option strategy between the two countries. The better option is always to respect the other side and try to engage with the other side, try to grow your own strength is the better strategy, I believe. So I'm confident about the overall China-US relations beyond the 2020 presidential election.